session today. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever and whenever you're watching this session. Whether it be live or recorded, we're glad that you're actually able to join us. I'm Lynn Anderson, and I'm going to be moderating this session with Rebecca Shambaugh, the president of Shambaugh Leadership and the founder of Women in Leadership and Learning, a very accomplished executive. Rebecca brings a wealth of experience on this topic that we're going to share with you today. We're also joined by Patrice Durema, who is also a former senior tech executive. She's going to be managing our question period, and we promise to get to as many questions as we can in the time that we have. So as you listen to the conversation that we're going to have, I really encourage you to use the chat function and put any questions that you may have as we go on. I also want to take a moment and thank the Women's Business Collaborative for their work in supporting and accelerating executive women. For those that are new to the organization, I encourage you to go to their website, which is www.wbccollaborative.org, to check them out. Okay, let's get to the business on hand. Rebecca, executive presence is required to reach your full potential, and it's not an innate skill. So help us here. What is it? And do we just go out and buy it on Amazon?
Well, you can try to buy it. In fact, there's a lot of books on executive presence, for years, right? But I think it's one of the more challenging, opportunistic elements of leadership, or no matter where you sit in the organization. Presence is just so critical to connect and to really build that trust and gain the credibility that you need. So we're going to learn today kind of the key elements of executive presence, and really give you some practical tools, maybe some coaching advice on executive presence, so you can walk away with one or two things that you can punctuate or highlight or just be more aware of. But just to give you a context for executive presence, we've been coaching around this topic for men and women for a number of years now. But it's one of the top two types of coaching engagements now that Shambaugh has engaged with our clients, and for a number of women and for men as well. That's just as important. The executive presence is right up there with the number one, which is leadership effectiveness. But when I go into a client organization and I ask them, okay, if you're wanting this executive or leader or individual or several folks to be coached on executive presence, what does that mean to you? And they kind of think a little bit and they say, I know it when I see it. I can't put my finger on it. And so that's the whole notion of very difficult to give people feedback on executive presence, very difficult to really understand what are the norms and the expectations around executive presence on a team, organization, or within culture, right? So as Lynn said, we're going to talk about it. We're going to define it, why it's important for you, and then really give you some key elements to put some meat around the bones in terms of what executive presence really is. So what I'd like to do is just to kind of give you our definition at Shambaugh, the definition of executive presence. It's the combination of behaviors and attitudes that enable you to influence, to engage, and inspire others while aligning people to take the right action. So it's that accountability component as well. So we really put some more specific behavioral-based elements around executive presence so people can really understand and deepen their own self-awareness of how they're showing up and some things that they need to dial up, dial down on. But there's this terminology that we use, and I just want to think about this in the terms of executive presence. There are technical skills, right, that we all need, and all of us at this point in time, I'm sure in our careers, are very grounded in our technical skills, and those are really important. But, research will say, and this is conservative, that executive presence accounts for 26% at least of what it takes to advance in an organization, to expand their scope of responsibility, expand into new markets, really get that more visibility and high credibility with key influencers in the organization. And so more and more executive presence begins to be more, I would say, dynamic and is evolving. If we look at the post-pandemic, And if you're examining and reading some of the new leadership models for today and where, we are in terms of where CEOs are taking their organizations in terms of competencies and attributes, executive presence is important, but they're looking more at the empathetic leader, the inclusive leader, the collaborative leader. Not to mention that they have to be decisive and be strategic. So it's not only dynamic for people who are demonstrating executive presence, but it's also dynamic for you in your career, right? And so if you're early on in your development for a manager, senior director, there may be key elements that you really want to be attentive to. As you evolve into the VP and executive ranks and even in the board, it takes on a different color as well. So people are always refreshing. They're all dynamically getting different kinds of feedback to making sure that their presence is aligned with their goals, their aspirations, and actually their role and what they're supposed to be doing every day in and day out to gain that respect and credibility. So to bring some clarity around executive presence, Shambaugh did some research and they found that there were 3 elements that continued to show up around our coaching and leadership development programs. So we made it kind of simple. We really looked at these 3 elements that kind of break down presence, and all of them kind of interconnect. But the first one is that true north, emotional and social intelligence. I will say foundationally, this is one that we really start off with in terms of coaching and in our curriculum, because our thinking makes it so. That story going on in our head, that narrative, directly influences our assumptions and our beliefs and how we're showing every day through our nonverbals, through our voice, our actions and words. And so understanding what that story is in our head before we even come into a briefing or conversation. And maybe we need to slow down. Maybe we need to pause. Maybe we need to making sure that our energy is not been depleted based on things that we're bringing from the other meeting, or self-talking ourselves out of something that we feel like we really should be justified to really show up as a strength in those conversations with those key people in the meeting. The social intelligence is really that external radar, but it's being present with our presence and being present with other people, which means in a day like today, it's hard. You got papers, you got all kinds of technology gadgets around you, but it's important to be present with other people and notice how they are engaging with you, how they are responding to you. And that's mapping the room, right? And we'll talk a little bit more about that and being flexible and adaptable to make those adjustments, to connect with them and to get on their channel. The other thing is the strategic business context. To me, it's about a balance of strategic voice and actions with execution. And a lot of times we'll go in and we'll just talk about how we got there, why it's important, what we did, versus thinking and linking and kind of dialing up and having more of that wider enterprise view of what I'm doing, how I'm briefing in terms of a perspective or a proposal, but linking it back to what's important with those people in the room, right? So that's that kind of dialing up. It's the words we use, it's the choice of words, it's doing our homework. All of those things really help to build that strategic context. And the last but not least is our verbal nonverbal, our communication style. You mentioned, you'll hear me say getting on people's channel. Really important to understand how people make decisions, what the communication style is, and to really be able to align with that. And then the nonverbals, really, really key, which we'll talk about. But even now, everyone thinks, well, nonverbals, why are those so important in a virtual world? They become even more important because the on the screen is one of the biggest tools you have to really connect and be resonant with others. So it's a powerful force of communication that we can't take for granted. So that's just kind of a high-level definition of executive presence. But let's begin to really look at some foundational things around presence. Where we start off and where we kind of track our progress is really that feedback. And I would like to just, for a minute, ask you guys to think about, if you do get feedback, do you get constructive feedback? Feel free to put that in the chat box, just to get a sense of this particular area and where people are in the spectrum of giving feedback and getting it to be so it's constructive. Let's see if anything's coming in here. Lynn, feel free to call out a few, but looks like we're getting a few notes in here.
Yeah, I think I see a couple of folks that are actually saying that in many cases, they don't get any feedback. And so we'll talk about that in a moment, because I think that often people think they've done a good job, or they think that they're being perceived in a certain way. And maybe or maybe not, there's a gap to that. So I think that's going to be important.
Yeah.
I think others have said it, they're afraid. Some people are afraid to give them feedback.
We get those responses all the time. I always thought, because I was always a high achiever, I always thought in my own mind, my own narrative going on, that I was doing well and I was excelling, right? And I might have gotten an annual review that said that I was, as a marker. But I learned then in that journey of my career, that the perception or the presence that you hold and demonstrate is in the eyes of the beholder, right? And so again, it gets back to connecting the dots of how people want to, connect with you, what's important to them, what they value, and then being articulate and intentional about aligning your presence with the moment, with the context, with the agenda, so that you can convey the kind of message that really sets the tone for the vision that you're trying to create in that room. So I'll just tell you an interesting, fact that we run a Women's Leadership Institute called WIL at Shambaugh for now 20 years. And 100% of the women, 100% say that they really, really value feedback. Of course, who doesn't value feedback? But 87% of these women don't believe that they get constructive feedback. They don't know what to do with it. And so when that happens, right, we're kind of sleepwalking through our leadership to a certain degree. And so feedback is even more important in today's environment, because we need to realize that sometimes how we're showing up is not how other people perceive us. Or if we are looking at advancing or growing into a particular new role, taking on new responsibility, that may shift as well in terms of expectations or how we want to establish credibility and trust. So here are some things to really think about. Number one, people, as you can see in the data here in the chat box, don't feel comfortable giving feedback, particularly when it comes to around executive presence. So my recommendation is, and what we coach individuals to do, is to frame it up, right? Because one of the three elements of getting executive feedback and learning it and sustaining it is to get feedback. The second is observation, and the third is coaching. So when you're wanting to get feedback, or even after a meeting, or if you are going into a new opportunity, frame it up with a key individual, manager, stakeholder who has experience with you, and say, I'm really examining my executive presence and my leadership. And I wanted to really ask you, based on your experience with me, what are the one or two elements of my presence that you think are working, that I should really lean into and continue to expand? And then from there are always areas that I can grow, right? And are there any areas, one or two areas that you think of that I can really improve, that I can enhance, that I can learn to do better? And I use this sometimes in the context when we're coaching a lot of men and women. A lot of times their executive presence is tapped into when they're evolving or taking on more responsibility, or they're briefing more executives, higher visibility. And so that's aspirational to a certain degree. So we call this terminology around getting aspirational feedback as feet forward. Feet forward. Number one, if somebody is coming to me and asking for feedback because they want to grow and they want to learn and they're moving into this new role and opportunity, I might feel more comfortable giving them that feedback as opposed to last performance, presentation or project that I did. How did I do? Some people may not feel as comfortable, but if they can talk about the future and what you can grow into, that's an easy platform to jump off to. So when you ask somebody about your executive presence and you don't get a response, figure out why that is, but don't walk away. I encourage you to lean in and say, okay, let me reframe this a little bit better around what are my top strengths? What are some areas that I can grow into? And can you give me some specific examples around that? So when you're thinking about feedback, what I'd love to have you do is to expand your aperture and think of people, not just that you affiliate with day to day, but think of people that are outside of your day-to-day lens, but are important stakeholders, important influencers, people that are, in the talent review meetings, succession planning rooms, or leadership development briefing rooms, when you're not in the room, but they're talking about those folks that they want to consider for those next opportunities. Making sure that you're tapping on them and you ask them that type of feedback. because it will be invaluable for you to be focused and constructive and intentional around your presence. The other component of feedback is getting 360 stakeholder interviews, which we do a lot of, which also gives you some really specific opportunities to learn more about your presence and areas that you can continue to grow into and what people really, really appreciate and perhaps want more of. So back to executive presence and just getting a little bit more context to some things that can play out. This is just a mini little coaching example that one of our executive coaches gave me that played out the other day. Her name is Hannah, and she had prepared for an executive briefing. Knew her conversation up and down, was practicing day and night. But she was asked to brief several different executives, some that she knew, some that she didn't quite know. After preparing extensively, she kicked off the meeting. And within 3 minutes or so, one of the executives looked up and interrupted her and said, Hannah, this is good, appreciate your hard work, but it's not relevant to our agenda. And really doesn't have any merit, as he said, to our meeting business objectives. So with that, Hannah just kind of like was deer in the headlights, had no idea that was going to happen. The wind was shot out of her sails. She went back and sat at her seat. And according to what the coach said, she was just silent the rest of the meeting. So you feel bad for Hannah, right? All that hard work. But unfortunate that this was disrupted and she kind of got caught off guard. So I'd love to hear from you. Maybe this has happened to you. You've observed that. But if you were Hannah's mentor or coach, what did you observe? And what are some things, if you could just put it in the chat box, that you would coach her on, or things that she could do differently before she came to the meeting or actually in the meeting itself?
Rebecca. Oh,
go ahead.
Sorry. I was just going to say, while people are thinking and putting their commentary into the chat box, I just thought I'd maybe recap kind of where we are. I think you brought up some really good points early on about sometimes people think that executive presence, it sounds passive because it's about presence. But I think you did a really nice job of crystallizing that it's about what it's about is causing action in others. So I think that that's absolutely critical for folks to understand. And, with the feedback, while you were talking, what came back to me in my mind was, sometimes we've all been accused of being legends in our own mind. And asking for feedback is a good way to have that moment of time where, well, maybe the legend I think I'm in my own mind, I'm really not quite there yet. And there's some things I can do. So I think that that's absolutely critical. And Patrice, have you got some themes coming out through the chat?
I do. A couple themes. Discussion about one comment was taking what the gentleman said and then repeating it back has no merit in a form of a question, and using that opportunity as clear feedback and to show confidence. Also, before the meeting, talking to the attendees to understand their expectations of the meeting. So being prepared, not just from your perspective, but all the attendees' perspective. Then there's a question, what was the basis for her preparation? Let's see, there's a bunch of questions, so this is taking me a little bit longer. That would be extremely difficult, and exec would probably be rude. Perhaps she should have asked what he would see as relevant. So there's a lot of different ways before the meeting, during the meeting, on how to handle it. Yeah. With that particular executive as well as the greater room.
And you said something earlier, Rebecca, before we got on board, when we were having some, technical difficulties, or as I like to call the technical delay for every single meeting, and didn't delay us. But what you said was one key thing about executive presence is grace under pressure. And I think we can all say in this case, yes, we've all had rude executives. So how do you handle that?
Yeah, we're going to get right into that. And I think there's so many elements going on here, right? And I think that the themes, Patrice, that you called on are right on point. But the opportunity is, how do we roll into that, right? How do we address these issues? And so this next slide, there's so much loaded up in this particular topic here, briefing executives, but I just want to give you some high points that maps it back to the Hannah's case scenario, but happens so often, right? Listen, we're only human. We can't be hard on ourselves, but we get better as we learn. But the first thing is really setting the stage. But by the way, what Hannah did, she prepared very well. She didn't actually go into this cold, but she really failed in the actual execution of that briefing to some degree. Well, let's put it this way, from the coaching she's learning. But setting the stage, a lot of times we're running from meeting to meeting, right? And we're bringing the thoughts from the last meeting into this meeting. And sometimes we're bringing that audience that we were talking to into this meeting, and we're talking at the same level. So what's really important, even if it takes 30 seconds, is to set the stage. And there's a lot of good reasons for that, but setting the stage is say, here's my purpose of meeting with you all today, right? Here's the intention. Here's my vision of what I really want to accomplish with all of you. And here are the 3 crystallized points. Get to the bottom line up front. And why do you want to get really crystallized with what you're trying to achieve? To making sure that you are on message, to making sure that you are aligned with what they want to hear and not what they don't want to hear, right? And so that's really, really important. The second element of setting the stage and the intentions and the purpose is to let them know what you want from them. This is one of my big lessons learned. I just rolled right into the intentions and the purpose, assuming that they knew what they were supposed to do and how they were supposed to listen. But I learned to really back into this and say, Manny or Eric or Susan, here's what I'm really looking for from you before we get into this. And so I found in feedback from executives that they give me a lot of positive feedback to do that, because they've just come from 10 or 15 meetings or calls or Zooms or whatever, and they're just kind of going from one to the next. And so that helps them to get focused and honed in on how to listen to you, right? And cognitively, that helps them not to stretch themselves too much. So that's really, really important. I always talk about the time. This is going to take about 30 minutes. This is going to take about 15 minutes. Does that work with your calendar? Because how many times have you gone into something and you're cut short because we ran out of time? So you'll learn a lot in that first setting the stage. The other element of this is understanding the context. Okay, so Hannah got cut off because she failed to she did her homework, but she did the homework about what her topic was, her subject matter expertise, but she failed to understand the audience. She failed to understand what else was going on in the organization, who was in the room, what were their goals, how do they make decisions, right? How do they want to be spoken to? What are the top 2 or 3 things that they need to hit first? So context is really important. What else is happening in the organization? Just the hour or 2 hours or 2 days before you came into this room. I remember when I was in corporate America, when I was pitching, my first job was with General Motors, and they put me into the learning element of the organization after labor relations, which was a lot of fun, but I was building one of their first university programs. And I remember I worked so hard, 6 months to put this together, the budget, the team really came together great. And I came in there and was presenting to the key executive committee, and they kind of stopped me in my tracks like Honda, and they said, this isn't going to work right now. And I kind of took it personal. We'll get into taking things personal. But all of a sudden, I realized that they had just bought another company 18 hours before I came into that room. They were integrating a whole new workforce and leadership sort of bench into the organization. And while the university was important, it just wasn't the topic to be talking about right now. So if I was Hannah in that meeting and that happened to me, I would say, can we just pause for a second? Maybe there's something I don't understand, and I certainly respect that, your perspective. Can you fill me in more why this doesn't fit into the agenda? Hey, great, understand. This isn't working with this new reorg. You know what? Perhaps we can pause and come back in 6 months and reevaluate this. What do you think? Right? Versus personalizing that or just decompressing and being silent, right? So understand the context. When I was writing my book, Make Room for Her, I was interviewing a CEO out in Silicon Valley, ran a tech company. And I remember this story, maybe you just had to have been there to hear it, but a salesperson was coming in to pitch a whole re-engineering their whole operational processes. And within the first 2 minutes, He said to the CEO, "Great to meet you. I'm so glad I can sit down and share with you some of our success stories." And one of the biggest success stories is the utility company that we just finished putting in some operational new processes. And all of a sudden, the CEO threw off his glasses and looked at him and said, "You know what? We're not a utility company. We're a tech company. So what you're going to propose won't work. So you need to move on," in so many words. I mean, that's just an obvious thing. You would think that that would be a deer in the headlights with the salesperson, but you need to understand and get on their channel what's important. And you generally have about 18 seconds to establish your credibility, right? For them to lean in and put their other things to the side and really give you their fullest attention. Understanding the context is also understanding your role. Many times you get invited to meetings. Understand what your role is. If I'm the subject matter expert, maybe people do want you to speak up and lead the conversation, perhaps even make those decisions. But if you're a person that's been invited to sit around the table and listen to other people and collaborate and brainstorm, then that's more about getting input from other people, building upon other people's ideas, as opposed to leading the meeting. Or maybe it's just inviting you to your managers come to ask you to come into the meeting, just sit, observe, listen, perhaps ask a few questions. So before you go into the room, understand your role. And I say this because a lot of times you're invited to a meeting and there's an expectation that people want you to be an active participant. They want to hear your value because they don't, you're in another sort of field of work, right? And they're in this other lane of the organization. So they really want to hear all the diverse perspectives so they can hone in and make a thoughtful decision, right? Because if you don't provide a perspective and there's that expectation, then what's the alternative? People may assume that you're not interested or you don't know, right? So that notion of being an active participant when people expect that is really, really important. We've been talking about this, but kind of balancing execution, with this other kind of piece around pain point is understanding that your strategic voice is really important, but sometimes the element of execution of how we're going to do it is important. But I always say there's a lot of ways to develop that strategic mindset, right? Again, dial up, start with the strategic goals and how that's going to connect with what you're trying to do as talking about the project that you've been working upon, how it's going, how you're doing it, but more about a think and link mindset. Have that enterprise view. Talk about what your perspective is or what you're proposing, but how that maps back to and concerns them or would be a benefit or value to them. Talk about downstream impact of how this is going to affect the rest of the organization, the customer, and so on and so on. Right. So I think the other thing around this whole balance execution is the voice with strategic voice. And I think it's, important to be a woman or be a person of a few words. Get your bottom line up front. Don't wait till the end. Right. Speak the words of business. Right. Have that business acumen. And I will say one of the things that really helped me in how we coach people to have that enterprise view, that strategic lens to expand the aperture, is ensuring that you have fostered and taken time to develop those strategic, more senior, influential relationships. Because once you do, and I coach people to go back and have executive interviews when we're trying to expand their leadership lens and their business acumen, is to identify 3 or 4 influencers, executives that they may not know necessarily, but they need to get to know to expand that lens. So sitting down with them say, hey, I'd like to have 15, 20 minutes to 30 minutes with you. Ask them what they do. What are their key goals and objectives? What are their problems? What keeps them up at night? And how you perhaps can be a solution to them, right? So that gives you a different context and a different meaning for those diverse people that are sitting around the ring. So you can better think and link to what's important to them, as opposed to kind of operating in more of the silo, if you will. So really important to have those strategic relationships. One of the best things you can do to become more of that strategic leader. Now, I mentioned this last one earlier, but staying calm under pressure. And I think Lynn mentioned that too. Given the world that we're in, it's dynamic, it's changing, there's crisis, there's surprises every day. So I think it's really important that we come into a room and knowing that there could be a derailment. Somebody could catch you off guard, right? Or whatever, a pressured sort of emotional reaction. So number one is try not to bring your emotions into the room. Remember I talked about the university thing? Detach from personalizing this. Have an expectation that it's hard work, but the point of the conversation is to really go around and get people's input. And if it's right, it's right at the right time. If it's not, then learn why that is. But don't take it personal and go into an emotional tailspin. That's being able to self-manage. That's that emotional intelligence. So number one, don't bring your emotions into the room and detach from those as much as possible and avoid those emotional tailspins. Stay with the facts, right? Ask strategic questions if you need to get back on track. Really, really important. I think the other thing that really helps, and I was talking to one of my executive coaches, Nancy Deviney, on this earlier last week, is, when you're meeting with executives, briefing them, and some of you very well may be executives on the line here, is that, things could change dynamically day to day. So come prepared. Think through which, there could be 1 or 2 or 3 scenarios that could play out in this meeting, right? And so making sure that you have 1, 2, 3 sort of ways to look at this, or if they catch you on guard and say, why didn't you make your numbers? Be prepared to answer that. Even if they want to understand your sales strategy in the meeting, be prepared to answer or respond to these other types of questions that may be top of mind for them, but you didn't really think that was part of the presentation. So the more that you can prepare, the more calm you'll be, the more resonant you'll be with them, and you'll be able to really speak and have more of a consultative conversation with them. So briefing executives is really, really important, outside of the fact that having that strategic mindset can be developed easily by having more of those broader, CEO, executive, influential stakeholders around you.
I think that is absolutely critical, Rebecca. My team and I used to laugh about what we used to call executive briefings as the thrill of victory or the agony of defeat. It just depended on the day, and to your point, what they had dealt with just before you. And even in meetings where I've been, part of it the whole time, I've actually had watched somebody that went in front of me. Their presentation did not go well. And one of the things you always hope is that whoever goes in front of you does well, so that, that everybody's in a good mood. But in this case, it did not go well. And so I went up next, and I was watching the CEO at the time and their attention to what was going on and the questions. And so I did my entire presentation from the overview slide. And the CEO looked at me, goes, "Thanks, Lynn, got it. Right, you're good to go." I sat down, and my peer beside me wrote a little note and said, "Aren't you going to finish your slides?" To which I wrote back, "No, I'm done. I'm sitting down." And I think that's also kind of an important thing, is understand when it's over, stop talking.
Right.
Because I've seen people unsell the deal, so to speak,
Right.
to quote Patrice on that one.
Oh, yeah.
So that's great. We know we have to brief them. And now, you talked about a big area around nonverbal communication. So it's now, we're not focusing on what we're saying, but we're going to focus on, what else is talking beyond just our mouths. So help us with that, will you?
Yeah, I just want to bring out a couple more things on this briefing executives. Thank you for that recap, Lynn. I think that also, I mentioned about getting on people's channel, and I also mentioned about the deer in the headlights. I mean, have you ever felt that you're talking to somebody for the first 30 seconds and they're just like, I don't get it, I don't understand? Really important that before you go into the room is to understand people's thought process, thinking style, cognitive style, how they make decisions, how they, do they like to engage in critical thinking? Are they more detail oriented? Are they more big picture? Are they more relational? And so begin to adapt and flex your style right at the opening to be able to connect and be resonant with them, right? So, and I guarantee you in a given day, different styles come across in a broad spectrum. But if we're engaging, and I'm talking with a CEO who's very conceptual, big thinker, or an executive or my manager, but I'm coming in with more of the detail orientation, how I got from A to B, he's going to check out or she's going to check out within the first 30 seconds, right? So, and if you don't know these people's style, you haven't met them, meet somebody, find somebody who knows them, in terms of how they want to be communicated to. And the key thing, one of the key things around executive presence is being, not only resilient, but being adaptable and flexible, right? So style, communication style is really important. Just to give a note, I think we're going to get that in a handout after the session, but one of the HBR articles I wrote was on this exact topic about how do you brief executives to sound like a leader, think about what you say and how and when you say it. So a little more sort of narrative on that if you wanted to tune into that particular article. Another area that I wanted to focus on, because this comes up so much, is about this being resonant with people in the room, being present with people, and that's reading the room. People come in well-intended, but a lot of times, have you ever noticed somebody who's coming in and they're presenting and they just keep presenting till they finish wrapping up? Okay, any questions? And the energy has gone down already halfway through the meeting. People are just reading through their phones or other things, and they've just kind of lost the intention, lost the engagement. And they've just failed to read between the lines. They failed to really read the signals. So part of communications, a big element of that, is paying attention to how you're showing up and how people are receiving you. And I always say, put the pause button on. It's setting the stage. That's a first part of understanding where are people? Where are they already distracted from other meetings before they come in? What's really important? Does this sound good? Do they ever have other things top of mind that they're going to be distracted? So kind of level set that up front. But the way that you can read the room is to what? Obviously, look at their facial expressions, their nonverbals. If they're looking at you, if they're leaning in, if they are, I know on the screen, sometimes that can be hard, but sometimes it can be very telling with people in terms of how engaged that they really are. If there seems to be an emotional reaction, or they were talking, engaged, and really seemed to be very interested in the topic, and all of a sudden the energy drops down. No one's talking because the elephant underneath the table you brought up, and people just don't want to talk about it, right? So that's reading the room. And part of presenting is being able to stop and check for engagement, check for understanding. How am I doing so far? Is it too much detail for you? Do you want me to go more big picture? Or do you need a little bit more detail? It seems like that, it might be distracted. It seems, given that you're going through the slide deck here, where can I hit this presentation so it's meaningful? And, and I did that, with an executive many years ago, and I still do it today. And they said, what, can you just go to the last slide? I just have several other things that have come up, and I just want to hear kind of what you're proposing. And so we can really get down to the final decision here. So really, really important to test for that engagement and to read those signals. And sometimes reading the signals is asking a question, right? Does this seem to be aligned with what you're looking for right now? Does it seem to be understandable to you? Is this the right time? The other thing is demonstrating empathy. And this is around the emotional intelligence somewhat that we talked about, and the social intelligence, but it's being able to actively listen. And this comes in at different levels of listening, but the first one is really listening to those around you. You could be engaging with them, but they seem emotionally distracted, or they seem frustrated. And so, or it could be a diverse audience that you're not used to speaking to. And so maybe you need to dial more into them to better meet them where they're at in terms of building that bridge and that connection. So number one, be open to adapting and slowing down and meeting people where they're at. I talked about communication leadership style. You may be coming in as the new VP of cybersecurity. They've never met you before, but you're the 5th boss that they've had in 2 years, right? All of a sudden you come in and you're excited, you share your vision, you said you've read over all the materials, boom, boom, here's the things so we can start turning the corner, and really excited about getting going. But they're fatigued. They're just not sure if they can trust you, right? And so being able to read that up front and knowing that your style may not necessarily be visionary right now. It may not be a style that's action-oriented and excitement. You may need to use this first 35 minutes with them just to meet how things been going, right? Engage them to really make their thought process visible, and to be really open to hearing their view and perspective, and maybe asking them, what do you see as the future? What does success look like for you, right? So again, be empathetic with people, walk in their shoes, notice how they're responding to you and receiving to you, and then be able to adapt to that. That's the art of being sensitized to the environment and people. And that's being authentic to the situation at hand, right? So that active listening not only comes with how you're observing people in the room, but that active listening is also listening to the narrative in your head, that level one listening, to making sure that you're not being influenced by bias or assumptions that haven't been necessarily assessed. Then the last one we've been talking about, but assess absorption rate, right? You've been talking about this for months, for weeks, been preparing the report and the briefing, whatever, but people are just catching up with your thinking, right? And so sometimes we have to pause and making sure that they understand, they're aligned with this. They're kind of tracking what we're trying to say, right? Again, I mentioned to you, is this too much detail? Do you want me to go bigger picture, right? And sometimes it's just stopping and asking that question around their absorption rate. Does this make sense to you? Am I dialing into what really needs to happen? Are they able to soak up all of this information at one time? Do you need to kind of slow down a little bit? So those are the types of things that I like to recommend for reading the room, to check in, making sure that you're aligned, you're connecting. And it's achieving the types of things that you want to achieve for them as well in terms of these people on the other end, right? So it's a collaborative, collective engagement.
I think that is a lot of really important items and context. One of the things I think we all have, sometimes had trouble with is, moving through those different levels between, talking to the executive level, and then talking to our teammates on the day-to-day activities that need to happen. And I think the idea of having empathy, I thought your story was dead on. We've all been there, where you're on your fifth manager rolling through, and they come with a whole new set of ideas, and every ounce of strength as you as an employee and a teammate is I've got to stop rolling my eyes. I can't roll my eyes when they come in with, here's how we're going to be the greatest thing ever. And so saying from a leader perspective, maybe the first step is just to listen is actually the most important step, I think, particularly if you're going into a new environment with new teammates, because I think there is a reason we were given, 2 ears and one mouth. It's to listen first and then talk. So I think you've given us great insight in how do you operate at the executive level, how do you operate at a team level, and then how do you operate in a new situation. So really, really important. And so I led to this a little bit earlier. So it's not all in what we say. As I said, you have 2 ears and 1 mouth, but now help us with nonverbal communication.
All right. So nonverbal is, sometimes the biggest communication skill that we take for granted, but it really is around, getting ahead here. The nonverbal, I will just say this is a lot on the screen here, right? But the nonverbal is probably 70% of our communications, and probably all of us have been through communication courses. We know that. But one of the largest communication tools that we have in our toolkit that we take for granted, right? So I think one of the most important things here, not to go through all of this, is particularly in a hybrid environment or in person, out person, but in the screen, is making that eye contact, right? And nonverbal is also, shuffling, looking off the screen, reading other things. People can see that you're not engaged or you're multitasking. Nonverbal is the energy, it's your posture, it's excitement, it's your engagement, it's the warmth of your smile, right? That really connects and resonates with people. So before you go into the room, I invite you to think about what is the vision that you want to portray, even if you're going to be a participant in the meeting. Right? You're not leading the meeting, you're not briefing. Or what is it if you are you're leading or briefing that meeting, or leading, the team, or taking charge of briefing the executives, right? Think about before you come into that room, what is the vision, or what do you really want to see as a result of that, or an outcome that you want to create? And then think about that versus running in what not only is the language, like presentation we've been talking about, how I connect with them, but what are the nonverbals that I want to convey that really aligns with that vision and that intention of that meeting. And so if it's exciting news, you want to have high energy, you want to get people excited, right? You want to have a higher pitched voice. You want to use some gestures, right? And you want to really convey that sense of openness and being excited for them, right? And so your nonverbals give you so much not being distracted by. The other key component, I think, of nonverbal is making sure that your words, making sure that your nonverbals convey the message they say, right? I remember a story a long, long time ago in a leadership class that we were running, and somebody said, well, they came in and they came back and we were renewing our contract, and they had a smile on their face. They were excited, but they were telling us that they were increasing their annual fees and annual dues. And so I mean, that's so obvious, but so inappropriate in terms of nonverbals. Well, that didn't go off so well, right? There's a sense of openness, the emotional intelligence, the social intelligence, being open to receiving others, creating that comfort and space in the room for them to share, to make their thought process visible, to express their true feelings and desires, right? So I think those nonverbals have such a huge impact on how we begin, how we engage, and how we close a meeting. And I think nonverbals, there's this great sort of the notion of what we start off in communication programs and executive presence is pathos and ethos. Pathos is how people see you. It's what you say, it's what you do, but ethos is about how you make people feel. And I think all the things that we've talked about here today, but then that nonverbal really connects and resonates with people. I remember when Kathleen Matthews was still at Marriott International, and we did a lot of work we still do a lot of work with Marriott for close to many, many years. And Kathleen was in both of my books. We became really great colleagues. And I'd go over to see her a couple times a year over off of Rockledge, where their headquarters still is. I remember we'd go up to her, the 5th floor, the executive floor, and I'd say hello. She said, let's go down and have some coffee, which was on the lower level where they have a Starbucks down there. And so we went down the elevator, and we probably stopped at 2 different floors. And there were probably 4 or 5 people, 6 people that would be in the elevator at one time. And all of a sudden, Kathleen would turn and give this person full presence, like there was nobody else in the elevator. And just her nonverbals, her openness, her smile, her eye contact, her focusing on this individual and nobody else gave this person such a level of appreciation and value. And then she would just ask one question. How did that, briefing go on the South African opening last year? I heard it went really well in the last briefing with that new market. Well, thank you. I mean, that just made a world of difference that Kathleen Executive Company showed that interest. But it was her nonverbals that conveyed that interest and curiosity to really want to learn and to appreciate what they really did. So putting that into a little more context. So those are the nonverbals. I want to leave a little time here for Q&A, but this is just the tool that we use. We gave you a few, not all, but a few little nuggets around executive presence, hopefully bringing it to life. Some of these things you probably may have known already, but there's always opportunity to refresh, to repunctuate, or to be more intentional on. So just think one thing you can think about today, an opportunity, and then perhaps today, this afternoon, tomorrow, and where you're going to be able to use this or demonstrate that or put that into practice. Or maybe it's somebody that works for you on your team, colleague you're coaching, mentoring, sponsoring. Maybe this is an opportunity to go back and provide feedback and coach with them as well. So I hope that was helpful. What I'd love to do now is Lynn and Patrice is just turn this over for a informal Q&A. Other thoughts, comments, observations, that also is invited as well. So turn it over to you, Lynn.
Great, thanks, Rebecca. And I know that there's been tons of questions coming in and tons of items in our chat. So let me turn it over to Patrice. Patrice, you want to walk us through the Q&A and the chat and what's on people's minds, and let's hope we can get to all their questions.
Absolutely, thank you, and awesome job, Becky. Loved what you had to say. So let me kind of go through a couple of the quick questions. That one question was, will the slides be shared? And yes, the answer is yes. You will be getting a follow-up email if you want to listen to a playback, as well as other support information for you so that you can continue your focus on this. So yes, you will be getting it. All right, I'm going to tee up a couple questions for Becky. One question is, you talked a lot about feedback. And we know feedback's a gift, but what if you really don't want it, but should have it? How do you handle a situation like that?
Well, I think it's a mindset, right? There's kind of like the fixed mindset, the growth mindset. Look at feedback as not putting yourself in the penalty zone, but it's really an opportunity. I find when I get feedback my first time, I just didn't want to get it. I was like, oh my gosh, it's going to be the worst thing ever. And I would worry about the night before my performance review, and it was just a dress rehearsal. I shouldn't have worried about getting the feedback, because it was not only very helpful in terms of, one or two things that they could guide me and help me to grow into, but also, to know that people really appreciate some of the things that I'm doing and to do more of that, right? So it's not always getting things that you can do better, but things that people really appreciate. And it's important and it's of value. Otherwise, we won't have that opportunity. But here's the thing about feedback. I think a lot of us, and there is this notion, I hate to put men and women in a box because I'm not about that, but still, women tend to be hard on themselves. The narrative, the level one listening, the narrative, the story going on in our head is, I can do better. I'm not good enough. The striving perfectionist, right? And I am a recovering perfectionist, by the way. So feedback was like, I don't want to go there because I know there's something that I'm not doing right, because I'm an A+ high achiever. But I think if you look at it as feedback is an opportunity to grow. And I have found that those managers, executives, leaders, and when their direct reports come and ask them for feedback in such a way that it's constructive and it's intentional, they really appreciate that. And that says a lot for them, that they want to strive to really seek my perspective and they respect my perspective. So I think it's about checking in with our own beliefs and assumptions about feedback. And I also think what can give us confidence is to prepare how we ask those questions, right? I just came off of a presentation or a briefing. Look, I know I can always improve, but is there other areas that you think that you would say, keep doing it, and other areas, one area that you think I could really improve on, or something you could help me with, right? So don't be hard on yourself. I mean, I think the biggest areas of growth for people, individuals, and all the interviews I've done with executives, CEOs, and colleagues out there is because they got that feedback. But it was constructive in such a way they knew what to do with it. And it may not have been perfectly a colorful, brilliant A+ feedback, but it was something that I knew I could do something about it. And then that next time around, I was much better around because of that. I owe people a lot of thank yous for that feedback over the years. So.
Yeah, and you know what, Rebecca, I think you hit it right on. It's hard to hear, but not hearing it doesn't make it go away. So at least if you hear it, you can adjust to it, and and in some cases you may decide not to take that particular feedback, but ultimately at least you know what people are thinking, and you can make your decision based on that, not what you think they're thinking.
Excellent. All right. Next one is, Becky, you talked about nonverbals being as strong and powerful as verbals. In the virtual world that we live in, and the way society has been, clothes and appearances have changed. How much do you put a focus on dressing the part, or what you wear?
That's a great question. And here's what I've noticed. Over the last 2+ years, everyone's been working at home, right? Good or bad, some people want to get back in the office, I know, but I think we've become a little laxed. And I mean, I think people can still dress casual and look professional, but we've seen people with some pretty wild things going on with hair, with hoodies, and I think you still have to dress your part, right? And I'm not saying stand out, but we talk about the nonverbals. Hair is a part of grooming, is a part of our nonverbals. And people will make and shape and form an assumption, right or wrong, in the first 30 seconds. And dress is not all of it, but it's part of it. So I think it's okay to be a little more relaxed, in various Zoom, WebEx settings, right? In fact, some ways I think it's kind of an equalizer with everyone at home. But I do think that there are the appropriate times to really dress for the part, dress for the conversation, right? If you have a high stakes, important stakeholder conversation, is to really look your best, right? Take some time to wear nice colors and making sure that your screen is on, right? This is the only time that you can really resonate and connect with them on that voice to voice and audio, video, sort of communication channel, both those channels. So I think dress is still important, and I think we become a little lax. That's my view. I think it's okay to be a little casual, but I do think we need to be mindful of dressing the part of who we're speaking to and the message and that impression that we want to make, right? And a lasting good impression.
Okay, terrific. I'm going to go probably 2 more questions, maybe 3. One of the questions that just came in, which is around, I'm a very detail oriented person. How do I up-level my presentation to an executive? So making sure it's that right level. What would your suggestions be?
Well, first off, detail is always good. I don't want to discourage that. Detail sometimes, if you're just always in the detail in the weeds, it can lead to what we call that perfectionism mindset. So one of the things that we do want to do is to dial up so we don't come off with too much detail, that we're in the weeds and we don't think big picture, right? Because it can convey that we are the perfectionist, right? And we can't really think beyond our just day to day, and we're our own worst self-critic, right? So I think that's really important. But I think this is all about the pre-planning before the meeting, is to really listen. You can look on a company's website. You can look at town hall meetings and listen into the executives' top key goals, right? There are sometimes notes and meetings that they come off of that are distributed to the organization to understand their top goals. But this is why strat relationships become so important. Because if you don't know what their top goals are, if you don't know their communication style, if you are too much in the detail and you haven't had that opportunity to be exposed to what's important to them, this could be your first meeting, build those relationships and have that posse with this board of directors that know them, that have experienced them, that have briefed with them, and being able to do your homework before the meeting to find out how they want to be spoken to, how should I open up, what's their communication style, and what are their top 3, what are their top 3 sort of areas that are going to be critical for them, for me to address and link. Remember the think and link my details and dial that up to what's important to them, right? You're not going to have all the answers, but I think if you can be solution-based, as opposed to just throwing a problem and going through all the details, they're going to be much more appreciative. And so even if you take the time to think about their objectives and taking what you're doing and coming up with 3 recommended solutions, just to let them know that you've thought about it, you put some leadership into that, and you're trying to learn and take more of a consultative approach around that, I think is saying a lot. I mean, I get feedback from CEOs and executives all the time. People come by my office, but they just throw another problem on my desk and they haven't taken the time to really think about it. So number 1 is to connect with people and dial in people that know them. Think about what are their top executives, learn that, how they want to be spoken to, right? How to connect the dots with things that are important, top of mind, right? So I think those are, it's just really important to things that you can continue to do. And, you'll get better at it as time goes on. I mean, if you really want to get more, specific, is read companies' annual reports. There's a lot of data out there on analyst meetings and things that you can really hear firsthand what's top of mind, where the growth areas are, some of the significant changes and opportunities that are happening.
Right.
Yeah, Rebecca, I think what was so key.
Hey, Lynn, I just want to add just one more thing to that. I also think, and I just want to hone in on time of day that your meeting is. You know, what's the energy level? Is it early in the morning, later in the afternoon? And then how do the executives or even the people participating in the meeting like to consume their information? Sometimes as simple as video can work better than PowerPoint. So it's those little nuances. So Lynn, back to you.
Oh, I was just going to say, to underline what Rebecca said about don't drop a problem out there. Come with the solutions if you have a multiple choices even, and what your preferred answer is. And I think that is so critical. Other question, Patrice? We're going to do the rapid fire.
We are at the top of the hour.
Okay, then. Well, we will look through any of the questions, and if we think we have some key ones, maybe we'll respond via email to the attendees today. But first of all, let me thank you, Rebecca, aka Becky, for your time today. You've given us an enormous amount to think about. You've given us some actionable steps that we can start all implementing today. So thanks so much for that. As Patrice mentioned, we will be sending you out some additional information that can help you remain focused and help you start your journey in improving your executive presence. I'd also like to thank my partner in crime, Patrice, for her help in providing insight in today's coming event. And finally, I'd like to thank WPC for taking on this initiative. And so with that, I will wish you all a great rest of your day. Thanks for your time and attention. Goodbye, everybody.
Hey, Lynn, I just want to say one thing is that as a board director of WBC, thank you for, being, really key to push out knowledge from, a lot of the board members and other communities. This is what this is all about, is to really build more of a collective of knowledge sharing. So what a great opportunity and honor to be not only be a board director, but have the opportunity to be a part of the narrative to expand the knowledge of our wonderful community. So thanks again. And we'll look forward to hopefully hearing from you at some other point in time, and good luck with all of your great executive presence.